Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I'm going to be giving you my thoughts on Abyssos Savage, the most recent raid tier for Final Fantasy XIV. It's been a heck of a time, as I'm sure many of you are aware with me, and as such, I want to talk about each of the individual encounters, how I feel about them after a couple of weeks of repeating them and doing them for as many hours as I have, and I'm going to cover something a little bit extra that you might have been hearing about around the community near the end of this video. Be sure to stay all the way until the end. Anyway, we should probably get to talking about the first fight because I tend to do these videos off the top of my head and it kind of makes them take longer than they probably should, but I'm just so excited to talk about them. So anyway, the first encounter is against Proto-Carbuncle on Savage, and honestly, one of my favorite fights across the entire tier, and in fact, one of my favorite first fights that we've had in quite some time. That's not to knock the quality of first fights. Actually, if I think about it, historically, a lot of first fights are pretty good. There are a couple of ones that aren't, but a lot of them actually are pretty good. So the fact that this one kind of stands out to me, and I don't think it's recency bias, is honestly, it's kind of impressive after everything that I've seen at this point. I don't think it's my absolute favorite, but it's pretty up there at the very least. I'm sure that's a little bit of a surprise to some of you. I know a lot of people tend to think I want these hyper masochistic, super hardcore encounters, but I also know how to leverage my expectations that this is the first fight in a raid tier. It needs to be someone's introduction into this difficulty, especially if they just started playing way after Asphodelos and didn't manage to get any time in there. And this really just ticks all the boxes for me. It takes a lot of the normal mode mechanics and remixes them. It adds a few things that you can kind of tell maybe were taken away or at least could have been added with the way the fight was thematically placed in the beginning of normal mode, but it also adds in some brand new things that aren't too hard to figure out. There's usually one or two loops in the first fight where your hoops, I should say, that you have to jump through to figure something out, so you tend to die to them a lot. An example would be in Asphodelos would have been the temperatures, actually making sure you understood all the positioning and how to do all three of the explosions while also doing the mechanics from the boss in the middle of the room. It was all very simple stuff, but obviously that was still a bit of a pain point for people. For this encounter, it's the Devour mechanic, which is a bit of a pain point, but like most things early in the tier, it really only has two different patterns that you need to be able to recognize and memorize the movement for. So it's not overly punishing on the player as long as they're willing to pay a bit of attention and practice and whatnot. And that's exactly what a first fight needs to do. It's not there to scare people away, it's there to set expectation. And this honestly almost does a too good of a job at it, because I don't think the rest of the tier, or at least most of the rest of the tier, really stands up to the standard that this encounter kind of sets. I'm also glad to see that a lot of my predictions came true for this fight. It felt like an easier fight to predict, including the Devourer that we got. It's just, you see the reflex, you see the explosions, you think, oh, they could do very specific patterns here. And then they throw a couple of extra things, you know, some physical attacks, which we also predicted, dashes, knockbacks, which again, I also predicted. Pretty much everything I predicted showed up and then some. And again, I feel like that's a sign of a good normal mode, when you can look at it and you can build upon it and go, okay, these are some clear ways that they can go. And I know I've said that a bunch of times already, but that's really all there is to say about this fight. If you're scared of stepping into Savage and you've heard stories about how Devour or maybe Ruby Glow 5 are really hurting people without even knowing what those mechanics are, don't worry and just take everything step by step. You're in good hands with this first encounter, and if you can get past this one, I'm confident you can actually do most of the tier. Yeah, it's that high quality of an encounter that I think it makes 6 and 7 look a little less impressive by comparison. So really good on you, P5S. You get a 9 out of 10 for being the first encounter of this tier. That's just your overall rating for your encounter. Now moving on to P6S, this was against Hegemony. And you know what? This also went exactly as I predicted, and my prediction was not a good one. I predicted that this fight, you do it in normal mode and you'd be like, oh my god, there's so many things they can do. I'm going to struggle with this so much. But also the realistic odds that, because it was only the second encounter, that it would be a series of 50-50 decisions that you just had to do repeatedly. And that is exactly how this encounter goes. You get one of two patterns, you position accordingly, and you just have to know how to do both of those things on any given pull. That's every single mechanic for the fight. Maybe some of them you need to track an additional debuff, like where you're looking, whether you're shooting the AoE out of your face or out of your behind, or maybe the timer on one of your debuffs so you know when to get hit by another attack. But it's still a series of 50-50 decisions. They just happen more closely together. And because of that, I don't feel like this fight really ever kind of gets off the ground. It never really starts running. It just kind of jogs along at the same pace all the way through, even through the more difficult mechanics, things that may confuse people like Cachexia 1 or even Cachexia 2, which most people are just using the tank limit break 3 on now and completely ignoring it, but it's not that difficult of a mechanic outside of that as well. Heck, we try to do it correct, and then we still tank LB3, just in case, because the boss is dying so quick with a few weeks of gear that we honestly don't even have to think about it too much. That's another thing. Don't be surprised, especially with this and the previous encounter, if you start skipping incredibly long portions of this encounter, including Cachexia 2, which is, you know, that means that you'd be able to freely melee LB3. If you know you don't need the tank LB3 for Cachexia 2, give it a few weeks and you might just be melee LB3ing before that. Or maybe even you'll tank LB3 something else. I don't know. Seems like PF really wants to use tank LB3 for some of the mildly more difficult mechanics this tier. But either way, this encounter just, I don't know. It just felt less impressive than the first one. You've got baited AoEs, the ground AoEs swapping again. They're only one of two patterns, so you pretty much just glance at them for a second, and then it's like they don't exist. And as much as I predicted that would probably happen, it's more disappointing to play through than I think it should be. There's also some other new mechanics that are just kind of thrown in there. For example, the, as we like to call it, the flood ray or the limit cut at the beginning with all the numbers over your heads and all the swipes coming out of the boss. I don't know, it just doesn't feel thematically cool either. So I feel like this fight's lacking thematics. I feel like it's lacking interesting decision making or positioning or mechanics. It's lacking a lot of things. I don't dislike doing this fight. I actually think it's an incredibly chill fight to do. It's not super exciting, but it's not too boring at the same time. And you can usually do things to make it a little more interesting or to improve the success of the encounter itself. But that doesn't change it kind of objectively, you know? So Hegemony, you did your best, but especially right after Proto-Carbuncle, I gotta knock you down to like a 6 out of 10. I don't know what it is. I feel like second encounters, and this is not a pun, are always very middling. They just never really catch their rhythm, despite the fact that it looks like the devs are really trying hard. I don't know why. They just seem to not be able to fully grasp it or get it right all the way. Speaking of having difficulty getting things right, there is a curse that some of you may not know about if you haven't been playing Final Fantasy XIV for years. The second tier out of the 3 Savage tiers we normally get, in this case all 3 would be Pandemonium, in the previous tier they would have been Eden, before that Omega. The third encounter of the second tier has a nasty history of being one of the most hated fights of the entire expansion. Now, I don't think they fully embraced that curse here, but at times they come pretty close. P7S is against Agdistis, and I'm sure that's pronounced wrong. And you know what? My normal mode expectations were actually pretty high for this encounter, and it still does a lot of things right that I think save it from being a horrible fight. It does a lot of things with the arena. It forces you to really understand spacing and knockbacks and what the different mechanics do and how they can be rotated one of 3 ways. And it has some tank involvement with just the tank buster being one of 2 things. It has some pretty severe raid-wide damage that you have to plan mitigations for, use healing for. It does a lot of those things right. But it also is agonizingly slow and almost disjointed for the first over 50% of the encounter. It just feels like the boss is throwing out some random things at you that don't feel thematically cool. They don't feel particularly interesting to engage with, despite the fact that the arena should be more engaging and does get more engaging as the fight goes on. You'll be like, oh, I'm being, knocked up over here, and then I'll stand and wait for the AoE to pass, and then we stand in 2 different spots with a stack marker, and then, we all either stack or spread, and then you reverse it. Like, all these things on paper sound like they are very involved, but they're not as involved when you're doing them because they don't really happen at a pace that is exciting or worthy of a third encounter. When I look back at Phoenix, of course, while there are complaints about the visuals of that fight and certain mechanics, it's very snappy, it's very quick, and you feel like you're moving from place to place and piece to piece of every mechanic at all times, with a few breaks thrown in. And I think that's a really healthy thing. But other than the fact that it's super orange, I thought it was a really good fight. This, on the other hand, is more visually appealing. It's more tantalizing to the senses in terms of the visuals, but it's not asking anything of you for like huge stretches of time, and that makes it super, super boring. And then in the last 40%, they just machine gun mechanics at you, and you're like, okay, I guess this is just a backloaded fight. And that's another thing they have a bad habit of doing with the third encounter of the second tier in the various expansions. It's super backloaded, and I don't know how this keeps happening. It's just a really weird thing to keep happening at the same time in every fight, in the same spot, in every mechanic. I don't even know how it gets to this point. Maybe it's just because they haven't figured out how to scale the encounter for the second raid tier. They're so focused on the last fight, which we'll talk about in a second, that they just don't get some of the other stuff right, because the second and third encounters are always a little, and the first encounter is usually pretty good. And that just kind of continues here. That being said, I don't think it's all doom and gloom for Agdistis. I do think there are some fun moments to be had in the first 60%, and it's just upsetting that it's all backloaded. And that backloaded section can be incredibly frustrating because it is very precise on the positioning you need to use for all of those mechanics. So sometimes you breeze through that first 60%, you get through Purgation, and then you get to those last few mechanics, the harvests, and there's so many different ways floating around about how to do them. A brain dead way of doing this, a brain dead way of doing that, tanks invulning this. There's all these different elements that take place, and yet it just never really takes off. It never blooms, I guess. It's a tree. That pun kind of works. And it's just upsetting. So this encounter, I'm going to also give it a 6 out of 10. I don't think it's as bad as some of the previous third encounters that we've had, but that first 60% being as boring as it is, I really got to knock it down a peg or two. Oh boy, and now we get to talk about our good old buddy Hephaestos or Hephaestos or whatever. I don't care anymore. The fourth and final encounter, or I guess I should say fourth and final floor or circle of this raid tier, is against Hephaestos, and it has 2 different phases, both of which are completely distinct encounters with a checkpoint in the middle. Yes, this is a door boss and second boss style, just like Hephaestos. And there are some things to say about this encounter, but I'm going to try to keep it largely focused on the actual design of the mechanics and whatnot, and only touch upon a little bit towards the end about the controversy that has been around this encounter. So first, the first phase. Now, if we were going to predict anything for this encounter from normal mode, it would have only been for this initial phase, because this is a door boss situation. You have just about over 8 minutes to clear through to 50% of the boss's HP. Technically, you need to deal over 50% of the boss's HP, and then it will checkpoint you for the rest of the instance, and you can focus on the second boss with a whole new set of mechanics. You have to clear both of them within an instance in order to get any loot. Now, the first half, this first phase, this door boss, is fantastic. This is my favorite encounter across the tier. And again, it has nothing to do with the difficulty. It is just that they nailed so many things. It's fast paced. It has a decent amount of variety. It asks people to be a lot more cognizant of their decisions regarding buffs, regarding healing, regarding tank responsibilities. Boss positioning, boss spinning. so many things. It involves the arena, it involves both the floor, but the outside of the arena. It has knockbacks. It just has every element of a fight without pushing it over to that ultimate level. It absolutely feels like a Savage encounter the whole time. Just one of the better ones. There's so many individual things that they just do well. I could do a whole video about just this encounter, and thus I should probably make this the shortest description of the fight and how I feel, just to avoid the fact that I could do that. But seriously, right from the get-go, it establishes stuff you recognize from normal mode, and that knowledge is crucial to understanding things and how you'll be placed throughout the arena. It takes normal mode mechanics and just pushes them up that extra level. A great example is the Dragon and the Phoenix, the things that go line AoE, or the center of the room is actually safe. These are used, like I predicted, in a multitude of ways that involve sectioning off large portions of the arena alongside those line fires that kind of draw quadrants that aren't safe, or draw sections of the room that aren't safe. And it forces you to be very cognizant. Nobody can call these things out for you. I mean, they can try, but you really need to be able to do your own form of pattern recognition, putting a lot of responsibility on all the individuals. Of course, you can kind of look at what the people around you are doing, but that's not going to save you every time. It's likely still to get you killed quite often, especially later in the encounter when they start mixing this with even more mechanics throughout the rest. Then it has, of course, the transformations, the Hippocampus and the Gorgon. Now, I thought they were going to do more transformations, and I guess technically after the door boss, they do technically do more transformations. But in terms of the door boss itself, they just focus on making these things in particular more difficult. They have just a ton of room-wide damage, they have timed debuffs, and that's going to determine how you actually go about baiting the boss. It asks you to use so many different skills in like a 25-second time frame that when you're doing them are quite simple, but when you look at each individual moving part, it's quite impressive. With the Gorgons, it's very much the same. There's a couple of different outcomes, a couple of different ways you need to know to react to it, and you also need to be able to read debuffs on your allies. You need to know when a decision that you've made, a pairing that you've made just doesn't work, and how to adjust to that. And it's one of those things that really needs to become a silent decision, a silent understanding between the two players that they both know what's going on, or it just doesn't work. And I love that. I love when a fight requires teamwork, but requires everyone to understand their place on the team. And it's not just as simple as spreading to this location, or you're part of this light party. It needs to know when you need to swap light parties, how you read your position, everyone agreeing how you will decide your positioning based on where certain things are located. And the Gorgons, while very short, is an encapsulation of that. The in-between phases between Gorgon and Hippocampus transformations are also far more intense. In some ways, they are the more intense portions of the fight. You can call them Fire Phase, Phoenix Phase, Gukametz Phase, whatever you want to call them. But they ask you to constantly be moving around, repositioning, positioning either with or away from your allies, since there's a lot of spread mechanics, there's a lot of pairing up mechanics, there's light party mechanics, and there's also memory mechanics. You have to see the boss do something and remember when that's going to be relevant later on, about 30 seconds out from when you'll actually need to do it, while also still doing everything in between that moment and the moment later when you need to do it. So there's just all these different moving parts, and it's unfortunate that the fight led to such a controversy with what we'll talk about in a little bit, because it overshadows what is an excellently designed boss. It makes me wish this wasn't a door boss, and that you had to be able to do a lot of these sections and then go into kind of a secret phase near the end. I kind of just hope they bring that format back a little bit more, instead of these kind of almost divided in half fights. Even when you look at the non-door bosses back in Eden, they still essentially boil down to, here's the normal mode stuff that you probably recognize and is made harder, and then here's the stuff that's nothing like what was in normal mode. But they do it at like an early point in the fight, instead of kind of enhancing the normal mode to the maximum and then giving you something near the end. I guess similar to Winged Justice back in Midas would be the comparison of something I'd like to see return again in the future. But we have a door boss here, and once you get the boss to 49%, 49.9 to be exact, maybe an extra 0.1 just in case, you move on to the second phase. And whenever they do a door boss into a second phase, The first phase is usually very mechanically intense, but very recognizable. But the second phase normally just throws a series of debuffs and puzzles at you that you need to solve. And then once you've solved them, repeating them back is almost too easy. It makes the second phase feel like it requires way less brain power than the first. And that 100% happens here again. Now, it's an amazing transformation sequence. It's a great song. There's some tank involvement here and a lot of damage to worry about mitigating, covering, while also needing to spread, stack, all that stuff. But it's very rudimentary when it's not doing its very intense puzzle mechanics. It's just very movement intensive, and it's very specific to the movements that you need to make. I just don't find it as interesting as the first encounter, because again, once you've solved these puzzles, specifically high concept and more importantly high concept 2, the shock value is gone. It reminds me of Ultima Weapon Ultimate, where after we discovered that we needed to awaken the primals, essentially the entire mystification was gone and it just became the way to do it, and doing it any other way was obviously going to lead to failure. That happens here as well. The main thing is that during high concept, players will get DNA strands, and you'll have to force certain DNA strands onto certain players based on the responsibilities they receive. While you can disagree about the positioning, you could choose to maybe put people who are being infected in different spots and people who are trying to not be infected in different spots. It still ultimately boils down to only one way to solve the mechanic. And it's just about figuring that way out. And after you've done that, again, it just loses a lot of its luster. We went from being able to make so many decisions and so many permutations in the first phase to, hey, this is going to really confuse you the first time you see it. But then after you solve it, it's literally going to be one of the most boring mechanics, especially because it's all downtime. There's no hitting the boss during this high concept or high concept 2 phase. And that is something I always dislike. Even in the hardest of hard ultimate encounters, I like it when they want the players to be able to perform their roles while also performing the encounter, which is why I usually love the final 3 minutes of Ultimates. DSR has an amazing final 3 minutes that includes everyone needing to be involved with the auto attack mechanic, everyone needing to know where to go for the various Morns, for all the different positions that you need to make sure you can meet the DPS check. And that's amazing. But then we have these like large downtime mechanics like high concept that are just asking you to solve a puzzle, and it's like, why am I playing? Like, why is this the skill you require of me now, instead of focusing on playing my job? Now all I have to focus on is how I'm going to start the fight back up once there's a target to hit again. And that's not as interesting of a decision to have to make. The big cryptic thing is high concept 2, which requires you to do a very specific amount of fusions with different DNA strands to result in getting a Phoenix. Once you have the Phoenix, as long as everyone's at full HP, you'll be granted the Phoenix concept. You'll be resurrected, or technically saved from a death mechanic that comes later, given a massive damage buff, and then be asked to kill the boss in the next 90 seconds. It's really, really cool. But again, only the first time for me. Then the very last phase feels very, how would I say, very Ultimate-esque. The end of Ultimate phases, or the end of Ultimate bosses, most of the time are kind of free in a sense. Mechanically, it's normally, okay, players position like this, mitigate, heal, players position like this, mitigate, heal. And that's exactly what this is as well. It's a constant mitigation and heal check while making sure you understand a simple priority system that happens for 4 people at a time. And that's all it boils down to. But you need to be able to DPS during this, and DPS well, or you may just hit the enrage. And, well, we're going to have to talk about that in a second here, because, well, there's one element I've left out of this entire discussion. Now, before I do that, I do want to grade the encounters strictly on their mechanics and on how they feel to do, despite what we're going to talk about in a second. For P8S Phase 1, 10 out of 10. Loved it. I don't like door bosses, but as a just boss, as an 8.5 minute encounter, of amazing. Love it. If we can get more like that, I'll take door bosses, even if it means I don't like the second phases all that much. Good job. Second phase, 7 out of 10. I just don't like that. It's fun one time, and then it's kind of like going through the motions. You know, I much prefer to have encounters that are engaging when I do them repeatedly. And Proto-Carbuncle is more engaging to me than high concept and natural alignment, personally, when I do them on repeat. So that's why that's only getting a 7 out of 10. Now, that being said, there's been several folds of controversy regarding the final encounter. People noticed in the first week that the DPS check was insanely tight, way tighter than it probably should have been, something that, well, puts stress on a lot of middle core players and players who don't necessarily go super hardcore on these things, but just try to raid as much as they can, but also on people who were running comps that were even in the slightest suboptimal. Jobs like Warrior and Paladin, Red Mage. Not that these jobs couldn't clear the fight, but it required a lot more of those players and the players around them to make up for playing a job that wasn't deemed as good as another one. This is something that the dev team specifically tries to avoid, and I think there are just so many elements that were compounded here that led to the number of errors that we had. Essentially, people were just constantly failing DPS checks over and over and over again, but then a lot of times people would switch jobs to just jobs that even if they play at the exact same skill level will perform that little bit better, and getting to those points that they need to, getting past the door boss, clearing the fight, and that's not something that's healthy for the game. Now, some people thought that they shadow buffed it for tombstone gear, which they said they wouldn't be doing. They said they were going to leave it as is. And some people thought maybe it was just a little overtuned. Some people thought that it was just an indication that the job balance was that egregious, which, to be fair, it is pretty rough right now. But it turns out that the reason it turned out this way in the first place was because the dev team tested it so much, they got too good at doing the fight, and they balanced it around those way too good at doing this individual encounter players. Essentially, it was like balancing week 1 prog around people who had been testing and optimizing for 8 weeks. We don't really know if it was 8 weeks, but it's just the analogy that I'm making. And that led to some major issues. I think that also tied in with the job discrepancies, and some actual combat design discrepancies are what led to this issue being a problem. They may think it's only because they overtuned the fight by about 1%, a little bit more, about 1.5%. I think it is something that highlights other issues within the game, including job design and the combat design, specifically the involvement of 2-minute bursts being kind of the core of all of our damage. It means that if you are in any way suboptimal during those 2-minute windows, or if you do not make the absolute best out of those 2-minute windows, or if you don't crit or direct hit enough during those 2-minute windows, the difference from encounter to encounter of what your overall DPS will be swings too much. On top of that, any job that doesn't utilize 2s as well definitely falls a little bit short. Not to mention the fact that the second phase during the early weeks, you have this double damage buff from the Phoenix, makes the crit variance even worse. Don't crit enough during the 2s, the single 2-minute buff that you get during that time, that's going to hurt you really bad in those early weeks. Heck, even if you just don't crit outside the 2s, it's way too swingy of a design, and I would prefer to see them go back to having what I like to call a 30-second design, where every 30 seconds, something is lining up, but at what point in the fight it is changes drastically. Maybe at the first 30-second mark, it's just you using like a 30-second off global. At the 1-minute mark, it could be some light buffs, but not everything really lining up. At the 90-second mark, it's those 30s lining up, but maybe with some skills that are specifically 90 seconds. 2-minute mark, usually a whole lot going on there because there's a lot of 2-minute skills. Then you have 2 minutes and 30 seconds, which has a mix of other things. And then finally 3 minutes, which are the big buffs, where, well, depending on your raid comp, can be the big buffs or can just be another large burst window. You just had so many different burst windows that you were never reliant on a specific one or every 2 minutes. You were reliant on making sure that your best buff windows were best utilized and that your other buff windows were just in line with each other. And you could move things around for different parts of the fight and it didn't feel rigid. This fight exacerbates that issue, and that is the point I want to make. That should be a video all on its own, but I had to talk about that in regards to P8S because, I mean, I had to. It's just such an important thing regarding the fight. Now, normally that's where I would wrap up the video. Let me know what you thought in the comment section. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, you know, the cringe stuff that we normally do at the end of YouTube videos. but I wanted to throw in one more thing for you. You see, I was involved in my own controversy / drama with this raid tier, and, well, it seems to be exacerbated by people that aren't involved at all, so I wanted to just give you the entire timeline of everything that happened with that, just so the air is clear, and you all know exactly what happened and, well, how I feel about the whole situation. So before this tier even started, obviously I was looking for a static. My previous static disbanded after we got World 24th on DSR, and honestly, it was a great experience. We had, I think that group stayed together since like 5.2 all the way through to getting the World 24th on DSR, and it was a fantastic time. So I, of course, needed to look for a new group, and I was recruited into one that was largely just trying to put together raiders with a good history and like-minded goals, which is really all I want out of a raid team. Yes, I love to go fast. I'd love to be back in the top 10 world race like I have been in the past, but I also know that a lot of teams make sacrifices that I'm not entirely willing to make. You know, some people don't want to stream, some people don't want to be streamed, and some people just don't want somebody who is a streamer in that environment, because obviously it's never really like 100% head in the fight. You know, we are paying attention to our chat. We're not always focused. I totally get it. So that's why I just look for groups that are like-minded, and this group seemed to be on that page. However, within the first couple of days of us really raiding together, after going through kind of like a turntable of new recruits trying to find the right people without really a trial process, we kind of realized as a team that maybe we weren't all on the same page in terms of what we wanted out of the raid team. And in fact, we as a team discussed this very aspect within that first week. It was something that was really hard to admit, because I think a lot of us were feeling demoralized and pressured with how things were going in those first couple of days. We were making some headway, but it just wasn't exactly what we wanted. So that was already a pressure point fairly early on in the first week. Now, we were feeling that way on those 2 days for a number of reasons, some of which I just told you, but for another thing that we found out on the first day of raiding. You see, it turned out one of our static members had an emergency and they were gonna have to be away on Thursday and through a fair portion of Friday. Now, it's an emergency. No one's upset at that. No one's angry at that. You have to take care of your real life first, obviously. What it did mean, though, is that we found out kind of where everyone stood on the expectations of how our first week was going to go. Because from that point on, we essentially didn't have any more hardcore raid hours that people could commit to. Some people had only put away the 3 days, the Tuesday, Wednesday, and the Thursday. Some people had no choice, obligations, myself included. I had my own girlfriend's birthday on Sunday, and let me tell you, wasn't going to skip that. I'm not going to make that decision. So we essentially lost all our hardcore hours after that. But Thursday, we still had something we could do. We could run our alts through 5, 6, and 7 and try to get some gear onto somebody's alt to help us with P8S, because like I was talking about earlier, that initial DPS check was going to be something that we were going to have to overcome when we were more consistently getting there. However, admittedly, my morale was super low. It just really felt like I wasn't in the right place for what I wanted out of the raid tier. So I made a very difficult decision. I said, I don't know if I can keep doing this at the rate we're doing it, because it's just not a feel-good experience. I'm bringing negativity into the raid because it's just not matching what I want out of the raid. And it's something I always preach. When you find a raid group, if people's mentalities don't match up, it can very quickly lead to that kind of negativity, and that's what I experienced. So I quit. Well, sort of. I essentially said, I don't think I can do this anymore. However, I was at a bit of a conundrum. I am the melee DPS. I got all the gear. The most scum move in the universe is the loot and scoot. And so I pretty much said, as long as you need a melee DPS, I will make myself available. But this is not really matching what I need. Within a day, within an hour even, I didn't even like that I had done that. It was one of those, you're upset, you make a decision that you instantly regret, and I felt very emotional about it. The next day, I kind of poured my heart out to one of the team members that was there, one who is a great friend and who I trusted, and with that, we ended up working back together, and I ended up back on the team full time. So I was essentially only off the team for about 3 hours. And that's all that boiled down to. In those 3 hours, which was the Friday night where the raid was, where we were finishing up the alt raids, they had somebody else for that time because that person had already committed, saying like, hey, I can fill in for that day. Let me know. And then between them saying that and me talking to them and saying like, hey, as long as you need me to fill, I'm going to be there for you. Then they went, and then that whole day I just felt like guilty and awful and whatnot, because a lot of these people were friends. They're great people. And the thing is, they all kept saying there was no problem. They were like, yeah, it's a shitty situation. Like, it's not how I would have wanted things to go, but like, none of us are mad at you. And I was like, be mad at me, hate me. Like, I was like, I don't like that they are so okay with this. It's like, because I just had this, was just guilt ridden, and every other team member was like, yeah, you know, it's shitty, but it is what it is. And it's, I think a lot of people are feeling that way. I just couldn't accept that. I can't accept people forgiving someone doing something shitty so easily. So I didn't. And once I had permanently rejoined the team, we went through Saturday, Sunday, Monday, almost cleared on Monday. And then things started to turn again. Essentially, one member was burnt out from the first week, didn't want to play anymore. Totally respect that. We got somebody else to fill in, and that was good to go. Tuesday, California's power grid failed, baby. Well, portions of it did. Due to the overwhelming heat, California had several power grid shutoffs across the state, and one of our members, not myself, was affected by it. We got through 5 and 6, and there you go. Tuesday done. Can't raid Wednesday. Thursday, our healer has COVID. What is this dark cloud that is over our team that is doing this? But we still go in. We go in for a few hours. We get a few things done. You know, we work a little bit. But we now have a new member in place of the person who left, and that person needs to be taught P8S. Again, perfectly acceptable. This person has a great raid history, and they picked up on it super, super quick, as did another healer we had filling in. Both of them, awesome how quickly they picked up on everything when they hadn't done those fights at all at that point. So big credit to them. Couldn't raid Friday. Saturday, little bit of time. Sunday, little bit of time, and no raid Monday. On that Monday, was it on Monday? No, it was on, no, okay, so I skipped a part. On Friday, on my alt, I went in with a group of people, and they were decked beyond, like, it's ridiculous. They have 7 weapons already amongst the 8 of them, and then I filled in with a 630 weapon on my, basically only had the 630 weapon alt. And it was the worst day of raiding I have had in such a long time. Not because of them. Playing with them was great, but during the kill, my cat was throwing up furballs. I killed someone. I screwed up my 2 minutes during the final burst. And then my cat was sitting here with his chin covered in vomit. It's the worst. Literally, again, the dark cloud. And so I got a clear on that Friday on an alt. I got a book. That was it. I didn't clear the main. I actually went into Party Finder that Monday. I gotta say, Party Finder for P8S Phase 1 is amazing. Like, unironically, I thought it was great. Phase 2 needs a little bit of work because I don't think anyone agrees on the strats yet. But I was super impressed by it. It was a lot of fun. But yeah, no clear on the main. And to this video, still no clear on the main. But that clear has got to be a good one because I wanted us to die on the run. In fact, I thought I had killed us when my cat was vomiting and I wasn't looking in the screen and I killed somebody because of it. And then we didn't wipe because they were geared to the fucking teeth, and it's like the worst clear that I think is even remotely possible. It is the most, that dude definitely didn't deserve to win kind of clear. I don't even count it. So you cannot count it because I don't fucking count it. But it at least gave me a mild sense of like, well, at least I saw the end screen. That was cool. But that's just the experience I've had. And the drama that was built by people who weren't involved during that first week was immense. I didn't even care about them. They had no effect on how I felt guilty because it's the same people who say things all the time. The same people who start shit with everything. It's the same situation always. And it's not just me. They do it with other people. They do it with anyone they can do it with. It's from like a shit posting Reddit. Who fucking cares, right? But it was just like, it was funny. Like, it was stuff we were laughing at, like, as a group for, like, the whole week. The people that were trying to, like, make drama out of something, and the same group of people they were trying to make drama with were just like, what are these people talking about or doing? They don't know anything, do they? And it's just, that's how it was. But I still felt super shitty about it. It was absolutely a shitty thing to do, and I'm not going to hide from that fact. So I definitely had a moment of weakness. I definitely acted in a way I shouldn't have, or I shouldn't have jumped to a conclusion so quickly, even if I worked with those same people to then rectify said decision. It shouldn't have been done in the first place. That is the bottom line. As much as I sit here, laugh, have a good time, laugh at the people who are making it bigger than it was, it's absolutely a shitty thing to do. And I want to be 100% clear about that. And I have no problems airing dirty laundry when I have it, when it's on me and not on somebody else, because I'm an adult and that's what you do. You do something wrong, you learn from it, you move on. If it was me 10 years ago, probably couldn't make that decision. And I think some of you who are around for those times maybe agree as well. So that's it. My thoughts on the raid tier, what's been going on with me, why there hasn't been a lot of YouTube videos, because this has all been melting my brain. But now you have this. So with that, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for more videos on my channel. No, but seriously, hopefully you enjoyed the talk we had earlier. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing about this. And I'll see you in the next one. I got quite a few things to record after Nintendo Direct and everything that's going on, so keep an eye out. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.